In February 1952, Princess Elizabeth arrived in Kenya as the king's daughter. Within days, she left as queen. At her side was Lady Pamela Hicks, a young lady in waiting who had already watched Britain's rule in India come to an end. She had stood in Elizabeth's wedding party, traveled with Prince Philip, and carried a family name known across the Commonwealth. Yet Lady Pamela remained far less familiar than the people around her. Her life raises a different question. How could someone stand so near the making of history, carry its private consequences, and still become a footnote beside more celebrated names? Lady Pamela Hicks was born Pamela Mountbatten on the 19th of April, 1929. The names surrounding her could easily overwhelm the woman herself. Her father was Louis Mountbatten, later Earl Mountbatten of Burma. Her mother was Edwina Mountbatten. Her older sister was Patricia. She was a great-great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria and a first cousin of Prince Philip. But those connections explain only why doors opened around her. They do not explain what Pamela did when she passed through them, or why her own recollections became valuable decades later. For much of her life, Pamela appeared at the edge of familiar photographs. She was one of Princess Elizabeth's bridesmaids in 1947. She served as a lady-in-waiting when Elizabeth became queen. She traveled with the new monarch during the early Commonwealth tour. Her father became the last Viceroy of India. Her family later suffered the violence that killed him. These are not separate royal anecdotes. They form one life lived beside power, but never built upon a claim to power of her own. That is the thread of Pamela's story. She connected an empire approaching its end, a young royal marriage, a sudden accession, and a family disaster that entered public history. Unlike a minister, she did not make policy. Unlike a monarch, she did not decide the direction of a nation. Her importance is more particular. She was present in rooms and journeys whose official record could tell the public outcome, but not always the human change that followed it. This matters because the public often remembers royalty through the person in the center of the frame. Elizabeth became queen. Philip became consort. Mountbatten became a famous and controversial figure of 20th century Britain. Pamela's name was usually attached to theirs. Her own life was not designed around publicity, and she did not spend decades demanding a larger role in the story. That discretion shaped how she was remembered. It also explains why her memoirs later mattered so much. When she died in June 2026 at the age of 97, obituaries described the remarkable reach of her lifetime. The stronger point is not simply that she lived near famous people for a very long time. She was a witness who eventually recorded what she had seen. Before she could stand beside a queen in Kenya, however, Pamela had learned early that privilege and closeness were not the same thing. The audience for royal history often meets such women through a label: cousin, bridesmaid, companion, daughter, or widow. Labels are useful, but they can narrow a life before the story begins. Pamela's labels mattered because they placed her near constitutional history. They do not tell us how she endured separation as a child, what she learned in India, or why a former court companion later chose to speak about grief and forgiveness. The real question is not whether she was close to famous names. It is what that closeness asked of her, and what she made of it when the formal occasion was over. Pamela entered the world 5 weeks early at the Ritz Hotel in Barcelona, where her parents were staying. She and Patricia were born into extraordinary wealth, extensive family connections, and a household supported by nannies, governesses, and servants. Such details can create the easy impression of a protected childhood. Pamela's later recollections point to a more complicated reality. Her parents' public lives and private habits meant that the children did not always receive the steady presence their position might seem to promise. Louis Mountbatten's naval career kept him away for long periods. Edwina traveled frequently and lived a social life of her own. Pamela later spoke frankly about the emotional distance she felt from her mother. That honesty should not be turned into a simple judgment on Edwina, who had her own public duties and complicated life. The relevant fact is that Pamela and Patricia were often raised by the adults employed to care for them. A grand surname did not remove the experience of waiting for parents to return. There were also moments of royal familiarity. Pamela and Patricia played as children with Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. They were not strangers brought together for a formal occasion. The girls knew one another through the enclosed world of royal and aristocratic families, a world in which adults, houses, and obligations moved around them. That early acquaintance later made Pamela's place in Elizabeth's wedding and household intelligible. It did not make the relationship casual, and it did not guarantee that their lives would follow the same path. When war began, the sisters were sent to New York, where they lived with Cornelia Vanderbilt. Pamela returned to Britain within a year because she missed home. The detail is small, but it says something important about the gap between outward security and inward certainty. She had access to places most children could never enter, yet her childhood was marked by movement, separation, and the absence of routines that make a young person feel settled. Pamela's upbringing did give her useful skills. She learned how to move through formal settings, how to be careful with private information, and how to deal with people who expected composure. Those skills later fitted the work she did for Elizabeth. They came, however, with a cost common to children raised inside demanding public families. Adult duty often determined the rhythm of childhood. That is not a melodrama. It is the setting in which Pamela became observant, practical, and reluctant to make herself the center of attention. The Mountbatten family also placed her close to a changing British world. Her father's career linked the Navy, the royal family, and imperial administration. His next appointment would carry Pamela further than any childhood friendship or London ceremony. When he was sent to India, she did not remain an observer of family history from Britain. She traveled into the final months of the British Raj. This background also explains Pamela's later reserve. In a family where adults had public reputations, children could become part of the display without choosing it. Pamela learned that a name might grant access while also creating expectation. She would be expected to be poised at formal events, to represent the family well, and to handle intimacy carefully. Those expectations made her particularly suited to court service. They also made it understandable that, when the chance came, she would give serious attention to a home and a marriage not governed entirely by public duty. In 1947, Pamela was 18 years old and living with her parents in Delhi. Her father had been appointed the last Viceroy of India, and after independence, the first Governor-General of the new Dominion. The title carried immense ceremony. The task carried far more than ceremony. Britain was ending nearly 2 centuries of rule over the subcontinent, while Indian leaders negotiated independence and the creation of Pakistan. Decisions made during that period affected millions of people and were followed by terrible displacement and violence. Pamela lived inside the Viceroy's house, a building designed to express imperial authority through scale and ritual. It had hundreds of rooms, long corridors, wide grounds, and a vast staff. For a young woman, the setting could have appeared permanent. It was not. The very purpose of her father's appointment was to oversee a transfer that showed the limits of British power. Behind the official dinners, uniforms, and receptions stood a political order moving towards its end. That contrast is essential. It would be wrong to present the final months of British rule as a graceful farewell. India's independence was a victory won by Indian political movements, sacrifice, debate, and resistance. Partition created Pakistan and divided Punjab and Bengal. It set off one of the largest movements of people in modern history and brought devastating communal violence. Pamela did not experience that catastrophe as an Indian or Pakistani family did. Her value as a witness lies elsewhere. She could see the apparatus of British rule at the very moment it could no longer secure its future. She met major figures of the period through her parents' position. Pamela later recalled attending a prayer meeting with Mahatma Gandhi. She also knew of the close friendship between her mother and Jawaharlal Nehru, independent India's first prime minister. Their relationship has attracted decades of speculation, but Pamela herself maintained that it was platonic. It belongs in this story only because it demonstrates how closely the Mountbattens were drawn into the political and personal world around independence. It should not displace the much larger reality of what Indians and Pakistanis were living through. For Pamela, India provided something that an aristocratic childhood in Europe had not. It showed her that status could be real and still be temporary. Viceroy's house could keep its routines, receive its guests, and display British authority, but it could not prevent the end of the Raj. The lesson was not delivered as a speech. It came through the difference between the house's order and the transformation taking place beyond its gates. There is a danger in making Pamela sound like a hidden architect of events. She was not. She did not negotiate the boundary, decide the date of independence, or direct the political leaders whose choices shaped the new states. She was a teenager accompanying her parents. Her testimony later became useful precisely because it remained the testimony of someone close enough to observe the rituals, pressures, and private reactions of a governing family without claiming responsibility for the history itself. The pressure on the Mountbatten household was not merely administrative. Each public gesture carried political meaning. British officials had to meet leaders who had spent years challenging British rule. The family's movements, invitations, and social encounters could be read as signs of allegiance or distance. Pamela's youth is important here. She was old enough to register that the adults around her were living through an exceptional moment, but she was not an official whose words had diplomatic consequences. She could absorb the atmosphere without pretending to speak for the people whose country was being divided. India's freedom on the 15th of August, 1947, did not bring a painless conclusion. Pakistan had been created days earlier. On the 14th of August, families moved across new borders in fear. Trains and roads carried people away from homes, and communal violence caused immense suffering. A respectful account must hold that reality beside the Mountbatten's privileged position. Pamela later remembered a house at the center of power. That memory is not a substitute for the history of partition. It is one account of what an imperial family saw as the system around them ended. The experience also changed the meaning of ceremony for Pamela. She had grown up with royal occasions that seemed fixed and self-contained. In India, she saw that a formal institution could retain its uniforms, gardens, servants, and protocol, while its authority was passing away. That awareness would remain useful when she later entered another ceremonial world, the British monarchy. She would serve it faithfully, yet she had already seen that institutions endure only by adapting to changes they do not control. Her parents' role ended as the old imperial structure gave way. Pamela left India carrying memories that would eventually form the basis of India Remembered, published many years later. At the time, another event was waiting in Britain. Only months after independence, she moved from a collapsing imperial ceremony to a wedding that would bind two young royals to the future of the British monarchy. On the 20th of November 1947, Princess Elizabeth married Philip Mountbatten at Westminster Abbey. Pamela was one of the bridesmaids. She belonged there through family ties and childhood familiarity, but the occasion also marked a transition for the couple at its center. Elizabeth was the elder daughter of King George VI, and heir presumptive. Philip, Pamela's first cousin, had committed himself to a British future. Their marriage was celebrated publicly, yet its full constitutional weight had not yet arrived. Pamela's presence did not require a dramatic explanation. In the royal world of that period, family members and trusted friends filled such roles. What gives the moment weight is what followed. The young woman standing in formal dress at the wedding would later stand close by when the bride became sovereign. The continuity was personal, but it was also institutional. A friend from childhood would become one of the women responsible for supporting a queen's public duties. Her service began while Elizabeth was still a princess and continued after the accession. A lady-in-waiting was not a decorative title. The work included correspondence, receiving flowers, helping with guests, and maintaining the small essential order around official engagements. The role demanded discretion. It placed a woman near the center of public life while requiring her not to draw attention away from the person she served. Pamela's temperament and upbringing had prepared her for precisely that kind of responsibility. In February 1952, Elizabeth and Philip traveled to Kenya. Pamela joined the party as lady-in-waiting. The journey began while King George VI was alive. On the 6th of February, news came that he had died in Britain. Elizabeth was 25 years old. By constitutional fact, she became queen at the moment of her father's death. The announcement, the mourning, and the return to Britain would all follow. But for those traveling with her, the change occurred far from London and far from the rituals that the public associates with an accession. Pamela later described the moments after the news reached the party. According to her recollection, Philip took Elizabeth outside to tell her, and Pamela observed her body become still as the meaning of the news reached her. This should be treated as Pamela's memory, not as proof that anyone else could enter Elizabeth's private thoughts. Its power lies in what the memory records. A daughter was grieving her father at the same moment a new head of state came into being. The Kenya episode is often condensed into one polished sentence. Elizabeth went up to treetops as a princess and came down as queen. Pamela's account gives that sentence a human boundary. No ceremony could remove the fact that a death had occurred in a family. No private grief could delay the constitutional consequence. For the young queen, the two realities became inseparable. For Pamela, who had known Elizabeth since childhood, the relationship could no longer be simply that of two young women from connected families. The change also affected Philip. He had traveled with his wife as the husband of the heir presumptive, and now returned with the Queen. Pamela had known him as family long before the trip. That made the shift in Kenya especially visible to her. The royal party still consisted of people who had shared meals, travel, and conversation. Yet the rules governing their relationships had altered within hours. The distance between private familiarity and public office had become a practical fact that every person around the new sovereign had to recognize. What Pamela remembered was not a dramatic line from a film or a perfectly composed royal tableau. It was a physical response to news no one could soften. That makes the account more valuable than a polished legend. It leaves room for grief, shock, and duty without claiming access to Elizabeth's thoughts. For viewers who know the Queen chiefly through decades of official photographs, the detail restores the vulnerability of the 25-year-old woman before the crown became her permanent public identity. There was another reason Pamela was useful in such a moment. Her role joined warmth to procedure. A lady-in-waiting had to be attentive without becoming intrusive, familiar without forgetting rank, and ready to solve a problem without announcing herself as its solution. Court life depended on those habits. The public saw the monarch arrive, speak, greet, and depart. Much of the steadiness behind that sequence came from people such as Pamela, whose work was deliberately almost invisible. The tour was cut short. The royal party returned to Britain, where the new Queen faced the public duties of accession. Pamela stayed in service through the following years, including parts of the Commonwealth tour that carried Elizabeth and Philip through a demanding program overseas. This was not glamour without labor. Long days, receptions, travel, and thousands of small practical demands placed strain on everyone in the party. The lady-in-waiting's role was to anticipate and manage details that allowed the principal figure to meet the public without visible disorder. Her daughter India later explained part of that work in direct terms. A companion could know who should be greeted first at a reception, receive a bouquet, prepare for a dinner, and ensure that the Queen was ready for the next engagement. Those are modest tasks only when described from a distance. In public life, small failures can become distractions. Quiet competence protects the person whose role is to remain visible. Pamela's own account also reveals the personal shift within the formal one. She had once played with Elizabeth and Margaret. She had attended the wedding as a relative of the groom and a friend of the bride. In Kenya, the terms changed. The woman she served was now Queen. Pamela's job was not to compete with that change or narrate it to the world. It was to do the work that her position required and to keep the private material of royal life private. That restraint could make the work appear simpler than it was. To answer correspondence correctly, receive visitors in the right order, and remember small requirements across a busy program involved constant attention. The point was not to become indispensable through influence. The point was to reduce avoidable pressure on the Queen. Pamela's later accounts did not attempt to rewrite this service as power exercised in secret. Their value is the opposite. They show how an institution depended on people willing to make competence more visible than themselves. That is why Pamela did not become famous in the same way as her employer. The distinction was built into the role. The public was meant to see the monarch, not the woman arranging the space around her. Yet the private witness did not vanish. Pamela carried her memories forward. She was there at an accession, but serving a queen would not become the only definition of her adult life. After the long Commonwealth journey, Pamela stepped away from regular court service. The decision did not announce a break with Elizabeth or a rejection of royal life. It marked a change in the balance of her own life. She had performed a demanding role at a formative moment in the reign. Now she chose to build a household that was not organized around the Queen's calendar. On the 13th of January 1960, she married David Nightingale Hicks at Romsey Abbey in Hampshire. David Hicks was an interior designer rather than an aristocrat. The difference was noticed because Pamela had been raised inside one of Britain's most connected families. But it is more accurate to describe the marriage as a move into a professional and domestic world than as a public rebellion. The important change was practical. Pamela would become wife, mother, and partner to a man whose work centered on design, clients, houses, and private enterprise. Princess Anne was among the bridesmaids, and Prince Charles attended. This joins royal connections across generations, but it should not overshadow the couple. Pamela and David's marriage was not another royal wedding. It was the beginning of a family life that sat beside the court rather than inside it. Pamela kept her relationship with the royal family, yet her daily identity was no longer shaped only by the work of attending a monarch. The timing also brought loss. Edwina Mountbatten died the following month while on a visit to Borneo. Pamela's wedding therefore sat close to bereavement, as other major transitions in her life had done. The fact needs no embellishment. A woman who had already observed the Queen lose a father now lost her own mother shortly after entering marriage. The difference was that this grief belonged to her family, away from the state ceremonies attached to a monarch's loss. Pamela did not disappear when she left court service. The word disappear is too often used when a woman stops occupying a public position. She changed the ground on which she lived. That shift is a central part of the story. Her earlier life taught her how to be useful in someone else's public world. Her marriage asked her to help create a private one of her own. The decision also created a useful contrast with the story viewers may expect. A woman who had traveled with a new queen could have remained defined forever by that proximity. Pamela did not. She carried the experience with her, kept the relationship, and entered another chapter. There is no need to make that choice more rebellious than the evidence allows. Its force lies in its calmness. She had served at a pivotal moment, and then she made room for a different form of duty. Her marriage to David did not remove the Mountbatten past, but it changed the setting in which it operated. Court service has an established hierarchy. Family life requires a different kind of attention, continuity, compromise, and the ability to give care without a ceremonial role to define it. Pamela's capacity for privacy was not emptiness. It was a practice. She had learned to hold important things without making them public property, and that practice became part of the identity she built after the palace. David Hicks became one of the best-known British interior designers of his generation. His work drew attention for its confident use of pattern, color, and modernized traditional spaces. Pamela did not need to become an extension of his professional reputation. Her presence, family history, and social knowledge were part of the world around the business, but the marriage was not a stage on which she had to recreate the role she had held beside Elizabeth. Together, Pamela and David had 3 children, Edwina, Ashley, and India. Their household introduced a different set of obligations from those of court life. Raising children, supporting a spouse's work, maintaining family relationships, and making a home required the same steadiness Pamela had brought to public duty, but for a different purpose. Her children did not need a lady-in-waiting. They needed a mother whose attention belonged to the family's own rhythm. The Hicks home was shaped by design and by a large circle of friends, but it was also a place in which Pamela's past remained present without ruling every conversation. She could be related to Philip, a former companion to Elizabeth, and the daughter of Mountbatten, while still being the woman who answered to David and the children each day. That separation was never complete. In families like hers, public connections traveled with the surname. But she did not depend on a court appointment to give her life purpose. The family's life carried both visibility and privacy. India Hicks later became widely known in her own right, and she used family photographs, keepsakes, and conversations with her mother in the book Lady Pamela. That later collaboration is important because it shows that Pamela did not refuse her past. She chose the terms on which it would be shared. Photographs and memories could become a record rather than a performance. David and Pamela stayed married for 38 years until his death in 1998. To call their marriage a fairy tale would say too much. A long marriage has ordinary pressures that no public description can fully capture. What can be said is that it gave Pamela a sustained life beyond court service, and it provided the family setting in which her children grew up. The distinction matters. She was not merely a royal companion who had retired. She was a woman with a marriage, children, and responsibilities that stood on their own. That private identity later gave her a particular authority when family tragedy came. She did not face the Mountbatten bombing as an observer of an institution or as someone included in a newspaper caption. She faced it as a daughter, sister, aunt, wife, and mother. The roles that had expanded her life beyond the court also made the loss personal in several directions at once. For a time, that private life placed a measure of distance between Pamela and the political violence she had witnessed in India. It could not keep violence from entering her family forever. In August 1979, a bomb on a small boat off the coast of County Sligo brought public conflict into the Mountbatten family with devastating force. On the 27th of August, 1979, Lord Mountbatten was killed by an IRA bomb placed on his fishing boat. The attack also killed Nicholas Knatchbull, Pamela's 14-year-old nephew, Paul Maxwell, a 15-year-old local boy working on the boat, and Doreen, Dowager Lady Brabourne. Patricia, her husband John Brabourne, and their son Timothy were seriously injured. The event became one of the defining acts of violence during the conflict in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The names are important because the attack did not leave behind one famous victim and a vague circle of relatives. It killed a grandfather, a nephew, a young employee, and an elderly member of the family. It badly injured Pamela's sister, brother-in-law, and nephew. Pamela and her children had not gone out on the boat. They heard the explosion. That simple fact gives the event its place in her own story without turning it into a spectacle. There is no need to describe the scene in graphic terms. The human cost is already clear. A family that had lived close to public history now had to manage a private grief under intense public attention. Pamela's father was internationally known. The headlines inevitably focused on him. For Pamela, the loss also included the intimate knowledge that Patricia's family had been torn apart, and that a teenager and a local boy had died with him. The bombing created an echo of 1947 that Pamela could not have missed. As a young woman in India, she had seen political transition accompanied by division and violence. More than 3 decades later, political violence came into her own family. The two situations were not the same, and they should not be treated as one simple lesson about history. The connection is personal rather than analytical. Pamela had known public conflict first as a witness and then as bereavement. In later years, Pamela spoke about not allowing bitterness to govern the rest of a life. She referred to Gandhi's example and said that people had to go forward. This was not a claim that the deaths did not matter, nor was it a demand that grief be quickly resolved. It was a statement about what she and her family chose not to surrender after loss. Forgiveness in that context was not a denial of the crime. It was a refusal to allow hatred to become the final inheritance. Her daughter India later described the family's response in similar terms. The tragedy was dealt with privately, even though it was public. That contrast fits Pamela's entire life. The public could see the event, debate its political meaning, and remember the most famous name. Pamela had to live with what happened to her father, sister, nephews, and children's family. Her resilience did not require a performance. It was expressed through the decision to continue living without making anger her only identity. The bombing also clarifies why the final years of Pamela's life should not be reduced to nostalgia. Her memories were not merely pleasant access to a vanished royal era. They contained the end of empire, a sudden accession, estrangement within a family, and political violence. By the time she began to record them publicly, she had earned the right to speak not because she had a celebrated surname, but because she had carried a long and difficult portion of 20th century history. David Hicks died in 1998. In the years that followed, Pamela's role as a keeper of memory became more visible. In 2007, she published India Remembered, a personal account of the Mountbattens during the transfer of power. The book placed her own observations within the period when her father served in India. In 2012, she published Daughter of Empire, Life as a Mountbatten, a second memoir that reached across her childhood and adult life. The distinction between Pamela's books and later projects matters. My Years with the Queen was a television documentary shown by ITV in 2021, not a third memoir. In 2024, her daughter India published Lady Pamela, a visual book built from photographs, diary entries, memorabilia, and conversations. Together, these works gave Pamela a voice that was not confined to a caption under somebody else's portrait. She attended Queen Elizabeth II's funeral in 2022 with India. That occasion closed another era of her life. The childhood companion, bride, employer, and friend, whom Pamela had known in different roles, was gone. Pamela did not turn the moment into a bid for attention. By then, she had already offered the public what only she could provide: careful memories, often modestly told, of a life spent near the places where private feeling and public duty met. Lady Pamela died on the 5th of June 2026, age 97. Buckingham Palace said that the King and Queen were deeply saddened and remembered her long life and loyal service to Queen Elizabeth. Her funeral took place 8 days later at St. Bartholomew's Church in Brightwell, Baldwin. India Hicks said that her mother wanted it to remain simple: no long eulogy, no sermon, no separate memorial service, and strong hymns. The request was consistent with the way Pamela had moved through history. She accepted responsibility, remembered what mattered, and declined unnecessary display. There is a final reason her story speaks strongly to viewers now. Royal history is often told as a chain of reigns, marriages, and major public events. Pamela's life shows what that chain required from people who were neither monarchs nor ministers. It required patience, discretion, practical work, and the ability to carry private loss while public events continued. Her story does not diminish Elizabeth, Philip, Mountbatten, or India's independence. It gives the record another human scale, the scale of the woman who lived through the moment, remembered it accurately, and did not ask history to make her larger than she was. Lady Pamela Hicks was not erased by the palace. Her role was built around discretion, service, and the refusal to compete with the people she served. That is why she could remain less famous while still being historically important. She witnessed Britain leave India, stood beside Elizabeth at her wedding, traveled with her when a princess became queen, endured a family loss caused by political violence, and then wrote enough of what she knew for others to hear her own voice. Her importance was never that she stood closest to power. It was that she remembered what power became when the ceremony ended, including the overlooked women whose work allowed public institutions to continue even when official ceremonies ended and private sorrow remained unseen around them.